here. Paragraph 836. We have a bit more to get through here. So, it's difficult to distinguish from normal moral precepts. It's found at every level of human culture. The Eskimo who skins an animal with an iron knife rather than a flint one. Okay, so here you have an Aleut out in the wilds of Alaska, and some superstition in his tradition made him think that it was a bad idea to skin an animal with an iron knife, and therefore his conscience kicks in. That was an example that Dr. Jung gave. And so it goes all the way from the primitive all the way to the most advanced intellects, to the extent we have any of those. For the primitive, pure chance gets regarded as a magical influence. So this becomes like a superstition, like a rabbit's foot or a lucky coin. And we all have these things, I think. You know, at some point you've had a rabbit's foot, or you've had a lucky charm, or you felt lucky about something, and you're superstitious about that. And that's where these pure chance things get tied up with magical influence. And myths come into existence of their own accord. They are not thought up. Unity and continuity of consciousness are such late acquisitions that there is still a fear that they might get lost again among some people. Anyway, I don't know if I think we'll lose consciousness, but, you know, a couple billion of us might, I suppose. Thomas says, I recommend another movie on Netflix, The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. I'll look that one up. It sounds like it has potential. It gave me sweet dreams, a writerly movie. Andy says, hey, Skip, was Jung aware of theosophy? He certainly was. He didn't think highly of it. I can't put my mind on where he mentions it, but I'm sure if you go to volume 20 of the collected works and put in theosophy, you'll find at least a whole column of references to theosophy, and it'll be sprinkled throughout his collected works. Thomas says, what creates a conscience? Parents telling us something is wrong, experiences and their emotional results, like I felt bad as a kid shooting birds and stopped doing so. I think it's all of the above, Thomas, but we're going to get into that a little bit more here. Daniel says, this is making me think about so much stuff that the 200 letters check allows for seems insufficient. Too slow at typing anyway. Well, I'm sorry about that. I tried to do this on a video conference and nobody came. Only Dan Pohl and I were in the video conference a few weeks ago. I had thought that we had a bunch of people saying that they wanted to do video conference, but in the end, people are reticent, and they'd rather be, many of them would rather be anonymous, obviously with notable exceptions here. Grace says, Daniel, this stuff is like drinking through a fire hose, but it does get better. Paragraph 837, decisions, conflicts of duty, which is stronger, conventional morality or conscience? And Dr. Jung asked the rhetorical questions, should you tell the truth and involve someone in a catastrophe, or tell a lie in order to save a human life? And, you know, that's a big question. It comes up. It's certainly come up in my life many times. And, you know, I don't know if I can give you the answer here. If we obey conscience, we stand alone. If we follow moral code, we are righteous. Okay, so this is where the issue comes in, because you have a conflict of duties, And if you follow the moral code, then you followed the logos, okay, because the logos accepted this and said, this is the way to go. But when the situation comes up, something inside you says, you know, maybe not. This might not be a good time to tell the truth. Always tell your wife you like her hairdo. You know, that you're going to save a life if you do that. It'll be your own. And he says, conscience seems to be an inherent phenomenon in evolved brains, not necessarily a learned behavior, but a middle ground between instinct and learning. Yeah, but a very low middle ground, I would say, Andy, because Dr. Jung was referring to primitives here. So look up epigenetics. We not only pass our biological dispositions to our offspring, but learned social and societal behaviors as well. I'm sure that's true. It's unfair to have to face that question. That is, to lie and not save a life or lives. It's tough. Yep, that's what we're talking about here, is the conflicts of duty. And so we know, some of us, far too much about ourselves to pretend that we are 100% good and not egotists to the marrow. Always behind what we imagine are our best deeds stands the devil, patting us paternally on the shoulder and whispering, well done. So every time my wife comes home with a new hairdo, and I also have my mother-in-law living in the same building, whenever they come home with a new hairdo, I always love it. And Lucifer's there patting me on the back. Paragraph 838. What is the true and authentic conscience? That's the question. In paragraph 839, in John says, try the spirits whether they are of God. And that's in 1 John 4, verse 1. Historically, conscience is understood as divine intervention, the vox dei. And so, as a psychological truth or assertion, conscience is the vox dei. And in paragraph 840, Dr. Jung says conscience transcends the moral code, can also be false. Vox dei, it's a delicate problem. In other words, maybe this is the main place that Dr. Jung said this, you have to test the spirits, or actually John said it 2,000 years ago. In other words, we have a duality of psychic energy coming up from our unconscious. And the important point that Dr. Jung made, which I discovered maybe not for the first time last week, but I was focused on last week, was that the ego gets the final call. In other words, the unconscious will present you two solutions, one that's good and one that's false, and they both seem like vox dei. And so you need to make a decision based on the fact that you have to live in the 21st century. Now, maybe men in the first century didn't have to worry about their wives' hairdos. I wouldn't know. I mean, I think a lot of women at that time were probably wearing hijabs, and so they didn't have to pay attention to their hairdos so much. But we in the 21st century have to protect ourselves, we men. Thomas says, if your speech is not useful and beneficial, teachers say it is better to keep silent. Socrates' daemon was a conscience, perhaps. Yes, in fact, I think Dr. Jung mentioned Socrates' daemon right here in this essay. Andy, is this duality of psychic knowledge always striving for balance? This is not psychic knowledge per se. This is a complex. Paragraph 841. Conscience commands the individual to obey his inner voice even if it means going astray. So can you be disloyal to it? The reality is no one likes to consider his shadow, but the point is, if your conscience comes up and it's Lucifer instead of sweetness and light, can you admit that it's your shadow and not take it up? He goes on to say, without emotional dynamism, conscience loses all meaning. The goal of so-called scientific logos approach. So what he's saying here is that the scientific logos approach would like to give you a set of rules that you have to live by all the time. But the problem with that is that it injures a living thing within you, which is your conscience. So it's not healthy. So paragraph 842, conscience is a demand that asserts itself in spite of the subject, or at any rate causes him considerable difficulties. Every complex does this. Even domestic animals have complexes and moral reactions. So if you have the moral code, that's all well and good, and if you can live by it, that's great. But if you get one of these conflicts of duties, then you're going to have to decide whether you're going to go by the 10 Commandments or whether you're going to go by what your conscience tells you. And he says, or does moral virtue always prevail? Well, that clearly is not true. Moral virtue does not always prevail. And indeed, Dr. Jung said that it's a very close thing. There's a balance because this is psychic energy. And so it's really, as we're brought up and learn how to be human beings in a civilized society, it's us that tips the scales to the good side. It's not because it's coming up from our animal self as all good. That's not the case at all. Thomas is thinking of the story of Abraham and Isaac, vis-a-vis Vox Dei. Yeah, you're reading ahead, I guess, because that was clearly a case where Abraham had the moral code, which said that he was going to take Isaac up on the mountain and sacrifice him. And his conscience grabbed him and said, no, stop. And my rabbi friend tells me that human sacrifice was a scourge of all human cultures at around that time. And it was only when the conscience emerged enough to stop us from doing that we started to sacrifice goats instead of first sons, which is a good thing for those of us who are first sons. Obiami says, first person doesn't lie. This is truly an important topic. Absolutely, Thomas. Paragraph 843, primitive man regards the autonomy of the psyche as demonism and magic. The devil made me do it. Compulsions and obsessions. And so you can look around you and figure out whose psyche is still pretty primitive in American society, for example. It's pretty easy to see. So a good conscience would be genius, guardian, angel, better self, inner voice, heart, inner and higher man. Bad conscience is false conscience, devil, seducer, tempter, evil spirit. Only unconscious and wholly uncritical people can imagine it is possible to abide in a permanent state of moral goodness. If you can't stand self-criticism, permanent self-deception is the rule. The more developed you are, the more you have conflict of duties. The good exceeds the bad only by a little, if at all. That's what Dr. Jung's position is. And what I'm doing here is I'm cherry picking through these paragraphs. I mean, Dr. Jung's paragraphs are, I think he basically considered each paragraph a psychic fact. and some of his paragraphs can be 3 pages long, so they're very hard to follow. And so what I'm doing here is offering you sort of a précis of what Dr. Jung is talking about here. And then it's a starter for you to then go back and read the actual essay, which is in volume 10 of the collected works. If you're not a member of our Dropbox, please send me an email to skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will add you to our Dropbox. Thomas says, but why would Yahweh do that to Abraham? I think that you're talking about human beings before the time of Abraham, Thomas. And all human beings started to sacrifice and did human sacrifice. If you read Campbell's The Masks of God, and particularly volume 1, which is called Primitive Mythology, you see some really, really gruesome procedures that different groups did around the world in terms of human sacrifice. And, it goes to this superstition thing about the Eskimo using the iron knife instead of the flint knife. Something happened, and it happened the same day that some kid misbehaved, so they decided, well, we're going to sacrifice that kid because superstitiously it was his misbehavior that caused this big problem for the group, so he's gone, that type of thing. And so, by the time Yahweh was doing it to Abraham, it was already baked in the cake in the human condition. It had been around for thousands of years by then. Daniel says, I think everything could be an expression of the same thing, so I think that what we feel as good and evil is a manifestation of the same pattern repeating in all things. Okay, arguably it's all E equals MC squared. I grant you that. Ray says, sometimes the thing you love the most is what must be sacrificed, and sometimes just being willing to make the ultimate sacrifice is enough to keep you from doing it. Yeah, and actually Jordan Peterson came out with a interesting new video. I think it was by one of the people who steals his videos, but anyway, or it was published by one of the people that steals Jordan Peterson's videos, but it was talking about getting new wisdom. He was talking about, facing the darkest part, the darkest thing that has to be done. And I keep having to do that in my own life. I really love it. And Jordan Peterson's view is that we should really love it because it was the Knights of the Round Table that entered the forest at its darkest place. Thomas says, so he was testing Abe to see if he too would follow the sacrificial customs of the time. Absolutely. I mean, this is where finally human conscience kicked in and gave Abraham a vision that said, do it to the goat, not to Isaac. And it says, I think it comes from pain and pleasure. Pain is always the lack or loss of something. Pleasure is the gain of something, everything either attracting or repelling, dual nature of everything. Yep, absolutely. Though it was a myth, a teaching story, I always hope. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's somewhat historical. I think Jews generally think it's a historical story. Opiami says, I heard just saying that Joseph Campbell pinched a lot of his ideas from Mircea Eliade. Not only Mircea Eliade, but also, I think it's Eliade, I guess. Yeah, my criticism of Joseph Campbell was that he had written a book called The Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake, which is a terrific book, by the way, but he really knew James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake backwards and forwards. And so when he went to the opening of Oscar Wilde's play By the Skin of Our Teeth, he walked out because he considered it plagiarism of Finnegan's Wake. And I just had to chuckle when I heard that, because, of course, Joseph Campbell hustled a lot of the myths that Dr. Jung had in Psychology of the Unconscious dating back to 1912. And so, which was about the time Joseph Campbell was born. So a lot of the myths that Joseph Campbell wrote about came from Jung's work, I think, also. So Joseph Campbell was not above that, but, you know, all of us do that. I mean, that's why Dr. Jung's work is so prodigiously full of scholarship, because he had to footnote all the things, all the ideas he was taking from others in order to do his writing. Leonard Cohen's Story of Isaac. I don't know that one, but I'll have to look for it. And Thomas says, I love Eliade's work, and Campbell does refer to him a lot. You know, if he refers to him, great. My reservation was that although he does mention Jung, he doesn't do it enough to reflect how much he really took from Jung's work. Thomas says his work on shamanism and yoga are the best we have. Methinks, you know, maybe so. I've not had the time to go back to Eliade's work much. I think I read one thing. Thomas, I pinched a phrase from Eliade for the title of one of my books, Magic Sweat. My conscience made me admit this.